Hi everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I've got a very special guest today, Associate Professor Holly Lawford Smith from Melbourne University. Holly is one of the women that was speaking at the recent Let Women Speak rally, and you did get to speak, although lots of people tried to shout you down. I was there to witness what happened. And Holly is also the target of a pretty vicious campaign at the moment on campus to try and cancel you. I think you're an expert at dealing with getting cancelled, attempted cancellations. But welcome. Thanks for coming and joining us today, Holly.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about for the people who are watching. You know, what's your background here, and why have you attracted this attention and these people who are trying to cancel you?
So my background is in philosophy. I didn't attract any attempted cancellations until like 2018 when I started working on feminist topics as a philosopher, and started doing like a bit of activism and campaigning around women's sex-based rights issues, and since then, yeah, I would say there's been 3 or 4 serious attempted cancellations. We're currently in the 4th, I reckon.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're still standing, so
Yep.
that's great. And so one of the things that I've actually had supporters, some of our members contact me recently. They've contacted me and said, I've been called a TERF. What's a TERF mean? And I note that you call yourself a gender critical feminist.
Yeah.
Can you explain what those terms actually, what does gender critical mean and what does TERF mean?
Yeah.
So TERF is TERF. It's an acronym, of course. Yeah.
So initially, TERF was an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It is now used so widely for so many people that are implausibly radical feminists, maybe even yourself.
and my supporters probably, yeah. That's why they were confused when they were called. And I said to them, yeah, it stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. They said, am I a radical feminist? It's like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So it's sort of taken on a life of its own as a slur. I think there's an interesting question about like how serious it is. I think at least for the first few years that it was being used, it was often associated with, rape threats, death threats, serious kind of like vitriol and nastiness, really sort of targeted at women or lesbians. There's been like a partial reclaiming since then. So I think lots of people, might say like TERF party or TERF pride or whatever.
I know lots of people have like call themselves that now.
Yes,
like they've just reclaimed it, I suppose. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think there has been a move to like take some of the sting out of it and reclaim it, which is normal with slurs. Our preferred name for ourselves, at least some of us, is gender critical feminist. That's the neutral description. Although I think the movement, it's a kind of grassroots movement. It seems to be changing and evolving all the time. There are also a lot of people that just call themselves gender critical. They don't use the feminism part, or they're not coming at the set of issues from a feminist perspective or as feminists. And even some of the ones who are women and firmly fighting for women within the set of issues, some don't want to call themselves feminists. And Kelly J. Keane, who was the host of the Let Women Speak event, is a really good example. She's kind of repudiated the label.
Yes,
she's
I noticed
toying
that.
with this label femalist to sort of try to re-emphasize the female part of feminism.
Right, that doesn't roll off the tongue.
It doesn't. No, exactly.
No.
She's trying to make it a thing. Yeah.
But what does gender critical actually mean? Like, if someone was to say, what does it actually mean? If someone believes in gender critical feminism?
Well, to me, it means believing in women as a group on the basis of sex, and thinking that there's a distinctive set of political issues that relate to that group. So this is what feminism would have been in like the early 60s when the second wave kicked off, in the late 60s when radical feminism in particular kicked off. So really focusing on issues to do with the female body, things like pregnancy or breastfeeding discrimination, and then also things to do with like sexist stereotypes of female people. So maybe, she's more emotional and less rational, so it doesn't matter that she's got less access to education or she's pushed into certain professions. So that for a long time just was feminism, stuff to do with female people and their equality or liberation. And I think what we see, or what I see as the problem now, is that that movement has really been hijacked and turned into this kind of very almost about everything and for everyone social justice project. And there's a lot of policing of it being that way. It has to be inclusive. It has to be about trans women or centering trans women. It has to be about poverty and capitalism and climate change. And so I think the gender critical feminist movement is really trying to just reclaim a sensible political project about female people and their rights and interests.
And that's interesting. My understanding, I've never sort of, self-identified as a feminist, but I think most libertarians, which our party is a libertarian party, we believe in, everyone's equal. And I think, initially that was one of the major goals of the feminist movement was for equality, right? Yeah. And that's what we firmly believe in. But in a simplistic way, it seems like gender critical feminism is just thinking of women as biological women and as a group, as a subgroup of humanity that has their own special needs and interests and this sort of thing. Is it?
Right.
Would you think that
seems right? Yep.
Yeah, and up until recently, that would have been not very controversial, right? People would have said, well, women do different things. They have different bodies. They have different needs in some ways.
Yep.
But that has changed recently because there are people who are not biological women who take claim to the feminist label, I suppose. Yep. And that brings us to transgender women, I suppose. Yep. And so what do you think about transgender women, I suppose? What's your thoughts on, how do they fit into all of this?
How do they fit into feminism, in my view? Or what do I think about them, the group?
Yeah, so we have a situation where historically there's been this group of biological women who fought for rights, who've won lots of major changes in law and in society and culture and these sorts of things. Yeah. And then now that's there's this conflict, right? So now we have another group of people who say that, well, we're part of that group now too, and I'm interested in what's your thoughts on how that's operating?
So I guess a lot of work is being done by this kind of refrain, trans women are women. And that, I guess the thought is you ought to accept that on maybe independent moral grounds, because we ought to accept that people are who they say they are, or that self-determination of a certain type is important for whatever reason. And then it sort of just follows from that, right? So trans women are women, trans men are men. So it follows from that anything that a woman is entitled to, has a right to, has an interest in, it's for a trans woman too. That's where I think the conflict arises. I mean, you could also not roll those two issues together and just say that there are some clashes or conflicts just between trans people and women and LGBT people because of the specific kind of set of ideas that get pushed as trans activism at the moment. But I think it's easiest to see the conflict when you accept this kind of mantra, trans women are women, because now then domestic violence recovery groups are also for trans women, which means they're also for some biologically male people, and that also might end up then making the other women in the group feel really uncomfortable or unsafe. So just thinking that it kind of just follows anything that's for a woman is for now this group of biological males who identify as women, you just get this huge host of issues.
And I think it's really important to note as well that, from my point of view, and I don't want to speak for you, but transgender people have rights too, the same way as everyone does.
Yeah, yeah.
And what I've been trying to explore, and the thing that I noticed the most when I listened to what people were saying, is this conflict of rights. In that, biology, I think that there clearly is a conflict between the rights of biological women and transgender women.
Yeah.
They both have the right to exist. They both have the right to determine their own destiny in life and all this sort of thing. But sometimes in certain situations, you mentioned one before, like domestic violence shelters, for example, that may come into conflict.
Yeah. I mean, one way that I've been sort of trying to put it lately is trans rights are human rights. Obviously, we have a set of universal human rights we think every individual is owed or should have, but that's not what's at issue. No gender-critical feminist is denying that there should be universal human rights for trans people. What is at issue is whether trans women's rights are women's rights.
Yes.
Whether trans women deserve and should have access to women's rights. And again, I think it's important for anyone new to this issue. If you have in mind this case of a person who was like a feminine little boy, really gender dysphoric, suffered a lot, transitioned early, super feminine, you sort of think about him in the same way as like a very effeminate gay boy that was your best friend growing up or whatever, you don't maybe see what other women are seeing as the problem. So just try to also keep in mind, yes, there is that trans woman, but there is also the 60-year-old, extremely masculine person who has just transitioned maybe last year, obviously male-bodied, and now just kind of, say, wearing women's clothes or whatever. That has like a very different vibe when it comes to that person is now in your rape recovery group or in your changing room with their male body being nude next to you. So it's just like really important to try to like visualize almost the full spectrum of what a trans woman can mean, because otherwise I think if you really fixate on that best case pretty 16-year-old boy, you don't feel the anxiety that some women are feeling about certain what they see as kind of safety threats or privacy threats.
And so I think it's also important to distinguish that there is transgender people and transgender rights activists. Now, these are two separate things. Sometimes they are the same, but like they overlap. But the group of what we would call trans rights activists is much, much larger than the group of transgender people.
Yes, absolutely.
So the trans rights activists are very angry at people like you and potentially people like me as well. But why are they angry, do you think? Like, what is their goal here? Because like when I saw them at that rally, and as I've seen on television and media reports and social media, their main objective appeared to be to silence what people were talking about. That seemed to be like what they were trying to do in Melbourne and in these other things. They just wanted to shut it down. They didn't want women discussing these issues. But why are they so angry, and why do they want to do that? Like, what's their goal here?
I think it's really correct to make that distinction between trans people and trans rights activists. And I think what we saw here in Melbourne and what we seem to be seeing around a lot of these Let Women Speak events and around this issue in the world is, like what we saw here was mostly red flag socialists, right? And a lot of Antifa.
Yeah.
How many trans people were actually in that crowd? I don't know.
I'm sure there were some.
I'm sure there were some, but it's not like that is the trans community representing itself and wanting to shut down women. There are people who, for whatever reason, kind of far leftists, don't like what they see as our ideology, and they're standing there trying to kind of shut that down. That's not trans people. Something else is going on there. Now, why do they hate us, or what do they like? I think that's a very complicated question, and maybe there's a lot going on. I think some of them honestly really are just misogynists, and they've got this acceptable way to vent rage and contempt towards women. Like, this was just a group of women talking about their rights, and you have this furious, and I've seen them on my own campus, I've seen them at protests on this issue in the UK, just these extremely vitriolic, angry men. So that kind of like, it's undeniable, and you can see that. That's one thing. Another thing is, I think there are a lot of really well-meaning, kind of compassionate, kind people who honestly don't really understand the conflict of rights and really just think that we're being unkind. And partly that interacts with sexist stereotypes, right? Because it's a woman's job to be kind and compassionate and care for the vulnerable. So she's really gender non-conforming and messing up when she is like saying no to that man. But I think, yeah, like, for example, in Dan Andrews' terrible rant where he called us at the event like evil and hateful, whatever those words were that he used, I think he really came across, at least, like he just buys this idea that there's this extraordinarily vulnerable, on the brink of suicide minority group, and these women could only be motivated by a malicious desire to worsen their situation. Those were almost his words. So he just has no concept that we could have a legitimate political critique to make, or that there could be an actual conflict to give voice to. And of course, if that's what you think, these people are making a vulnerable group's lives worse, of course you hate them. So there's a lot of like illiteracy, I would say, on this topic.
And this exact conflict we spoke about earlier off camera, I brought this up in Parliament. I asked the Minister for Equality about, do biological women's rights and transgender women's rights sometimes come into conflict? And the answer was a bit waffly, but the general message that I got from the government was, no, they don't really come into conflict. They're repeating the mantra, trans women are women.
Yeah.
And I think, like, in many ways, that's like the heart of this conflict, isn't it? That some people believe that there is a conflict, and people like me and yourself, and other people seem to think that there isn't a conflict. But there's many situations where it seems almost undeniable that there's a conflict. Like, I mean, things like toilets and stuff. People talk about toilets all the time, and in reality, like, a toilets is like a pretty small sort of issue, but there's bigger issues here, like, prisons or really women's sport, right? Yeah. Like, just this week we had a transgender woman win the women's PGA golf tournament, right? Now, and there's been many cases like this throughout the world, and it seems clear that there's many women, biological women, who are not happy about what's going on here.
Yeah.
So it seems undeniable to me that there is a conflict that needs to be managed, and that should be the role of government, you would think.
Yeah, I really can't get my head around it. I mean, either they know that there is a conflict, but they just think it's so important. And again, this comes back to the thinking there's this incredibly vulnerable group on the brink of suicide, right? If you're Harriet Shing, you're confronted with this question about whether there's a conflict, but you want to just do the thing that provides support to this really vulnerable group, you're just going to say, of course there's no conflict, of course trans women are women. A trans woman is a woman just as much as any other woman, there's nothing to talk about here. That's providing like support and reassurance for this particular community. Don't worry if it's true, right? Because it's morally much more important to provide that support. So that's something that could be going on. It could be, she does know, she's just doing this kind of move that she thinks is important for providing support. The other thing that could be going on, and again, I don't want to, I can't speak to any of our particular politicians' beliefs here, but if you had a, bad science view of gender identity, where you really believed in innate sexed brains, right? So this feeds into the trapped in the wrong body metaphor. You really thought there could be a female brain born into a male body, then you could, I think, rightfully insist there's no conflict of interest, because that person is fundamentally female in just the same way as every other female. he's just had the misfortune to have this bad packaging. And I've seen them use this in like educational materials in the US. Like I think the metaphor was a Pop-Tart. And it was like,
I haven't heard that.
Like if a strawberry or a Pop-Tart was in the wrapping of a blueberry Pop-Tart, would it be a strawberry Pop-Tart or a blueberry Pop-Tart? And everybody goes with the real Pop-Tart, not the wrapping. Right, so they use that metaphor to try to say, like, there is this way that people really are fundamentally, but they can just be in this wrong carcass almost. So it could be that some of the politicians just, like, they never looked into it. They have this bad science view of what it means to have a gender identity or be trans, and then they deny the conflict of interest precisely on those grounds. And the problem is that's just the science is wrong of that.
And it's not just politicians though. I'd be interested to hear what your experience of that Let Women Speak protest was in Melbourne, and we both witnessed what happened. There was a large number of different groups. You've alluded to one of the groups there. So there was apparently the police said there were 6 different groups. I'm having trouble identifying 6. But certainly I saw a group of women associated with the Let Women Speak protest.
Yeah.
I certainly saw a group of what I would call Marxists or communists, the red flag people. Didn't see any rainbow flags with them at all. Then I saw a group of about 20 guys in black who turned out to be Nazis. We didn't know at the time. Neo-Nazis or fascists or whatever you want to call them, nasty-looking men. They're all men.
And then freedom people.
There was a couple of freedom people,
Yep.
and not many of them, I didn't think. But then there was the largest group was probably the trans rights activists who were...
Interesting. You're separating the trans rights activists from the communists.
Well, they were literally 2 different areas.
No, there were 2 areas, but they were the same group.
Okay, all right.
One of them had...
They had different flags,
One
though,
came
too.
early and one planned
Right.
to march to join that one, but the police had separated them until they could merge. But they were... You're right, there were like more socialists represented here, and it looked like more trans flags here, but that, I think, was the counter-protest.
Yeah, okay.
But so now we're still only at 4, right?
Yeah.
Figure out the other
So
2.
maybe one of the groups was me and a couple of my mates, but I don't know. But
That's true, but yeah, interesting, because I have heard someone refer to the conservatives.
one of my staff just said there was anti-war protesters on the day as well. That might have got mixed because there was another protest. I think it started at the State Library. I think on the day
I see.
there was an anti-war protest. So maybe that got mixed in as well
Merged in.
somehow. So okay. So maybe we have identified these groups.
So who would the conservatives be? Would that just be like Moira being a liberal as part of the Let Women Speak event?
Yeah, I spoke to a lot of the people at the Let Women Speak event, and there wasn't many conservatives that I spoke to.
No, I've just heard that referred to, and I wondered if that was another distinct group, but I can't quite figure out where to put them.
I don't
With
think
the freedom
so.
people, with the women,
No.
with the communists.
No. Although the Communist Party of the UK's recently announced that they're gender critical, so I don't know. Maybe communists are Nazis too. I don't know. It's all very confusing, isn't it? It's very confusing. But back to we were saying about the politicians have this view. The media, the way that they presented this as well, was
Outrageous.
disturbing and outrageous. Although, as many of my followers would know, this is nothing new at all. They've been doing this for a long time now, misrepresenting the aims of groups by picking out the typical way that it happens, and the government and the media both do this, is they will, if there's a group of people protesting about something and they don't want them to have a voice, they'll pick out the nasty and a nasty element in it, focus on that, and then say everyone is that nasty element. Now, in this particular protest, we had the absolute worst nasty element that you could imagine show up, the neo-Nazis.
Yes.
They weren't invited. No one was associated with them that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they did turn up and they did their silly salutes and all that sort of stuff. I don't know what they were chanting and stuff, and they had that sign.
Yeah.
But they stole the show, and I thought it was quite remarkable that a group of women turned up to let women speak, and they were all of a sudden being held accountable for the actions of a group of men, and they were all men.
Yeah.
it's like, what are your thoughts on that and how the media handled that?
It's so interesting to hear that this is a strategy used in Victoria and has happened before, because I think from our perspective, it was just absolutely baffling how things unfolded after that. Like, of course, I have had no experience of having that done to me or participate in anything where that's been done, so I have no template for that. And I think I feel stupid now, but I think I thought, like, the media is sometimes or often quite credible. Like, you can generally trust them. So it's been really, I know. It's so, and I'm like, should know these things. I think I'm quite naive politically in some respects, just in this academic bubble sometimes. So it was a very steep learning curve for me, and I think probably for a lot of the women involved. As you say, we just went there, and actually there's a sense in which it was a really joyful occasion, to be honest. Like, a lot of us really like Kelly J. Keane. She's been involved in this since, I think, 2015, she said. I've been paying attention to her and watching her live stream since, like, 2018. You know, there's a lot of people that really were excited to meet her and, you know, saw it as a moment where we've been kind of gender critical but kind of underground. People feel scared to speak up in their workplaces or with their friends. We had done a few speakers' corners but not advertised them because we can't afford security and we don't want to get punched. So it was like this, you know, there would be security, there would be police, we could speak our minds. It would be a moment to sort of have this message and maybe get some media and bring some new women in. So, yeah, it was such a devastating, maybe it's hyperbolic of me, but it was, I think, really crushing to see, A, that we were just completely erased from the narrative. Completely erased. Like,
no one spoke about the issues that you were talking about.
Nothing. Like, and even the photos, like, I think I looked at every news story that came out over the next week. There would just literally be pictures of neo-Nazis, pictures of the trans activist crowd, and then this description, anti-trans rally with neo-Nazi supporters. As though that's what that was. And so you're like, where are we? Where are women? Where's Kelly J? Like, it was, I found it so surreal. I found it surreal to see that language repeated regardless of political spectrum. So it wasn't just the left-wing media, it was almost everywhere. It wasn't Sky News. I think later in the week, The Australian, they still used the phrase anti-trans, but they otherwise reported accurately. And maybe it took like a week and a half, is that fair, for honest commentary to start coming out in some of the independent media. So it's just been surreal to me. And it probably sounds stupid to people who have experienced this multiple times, but yeah, I found it really destabilizing and surreal.
Yeah, it's been a big problem during the pandemic where the government has sort of weaponized and smeared against people who've had, you know, different issues with the government.
It's really bad.
Yeah, but we're sort of, I think we're used to it, aren't we? Like, you know, our supporters, we're used to that. We're used to it.
Is that normal in politics, or is that something weird going on?
No,
in
it's
Victoria?
fair. Well, I think I don't know. It's hard to tell. Like, it's certainly big thing in Victoria, certainly during the pandemic, but I've seen it throughout the world now in the reporting. Like, they're all reporting about Nazis and stuff.
It's just so dishonest. I mean, and again, this is me being an academic, right? Like, I value the truth. Why does the media not value the truth? But I actually am confused about that. Like, how is there not... I know you get trained in journalism. I know that there are principles of journalistic integrity. So how is there just lie after lie after lie just being put out in the public sphere? I'm sure I sound like an idiot, but that's how I feel.
It's a bigger question about the motivations and everything that's going on. But look, I feel like there are some decent stories coming out now. That this is a global thing, right? And one of the things that I noticed that was interesting was that the size of the Let Women Speak protests or rallies or whatever you want to call them, they progressively got smaller, and until, you know, like, it was very, very small by the time it got to New Zealand.
Yeah.
And I saw that like, I think that the governments, in many ways, like politicians, they're sort of in this bubble, right? And they see that as like a victory in some ways. But what do you think was the cause of these protests getting smaller?
Do you think they got... Because my impression was they weren't getting smaller until post-Melbourne. I think I watched most of the live streams, and I think there was a good turnout in Sydney. There was a very good turnout in Melbourne. Adelaide and Perth, I think, were the other ones.
Hobart was very small.
Hobart was after,
yeah.
right? So she went to Hobart after Melbourne when all the reporting had already started. So maybe I'm wrong, but my sense was that there was enthusiasm and joy and a solid turnout, some reporting, until this ridiculous narrative about the anti-trans rally with neo-Nazis. And then Hobart, I take it, I mean, one thing is like it's just much more co-opted by this ideology. Like they have like not just self-ID but no sex option for their birth certificates, right? There is like a lot of trans activism there. They would decline to have lesbian-only events because that would be exclusionary of trans women. So it's, I think because it's a smaller place and it's highly co-opted, you would expect there to be more fear or a more disproportionate numbers between our event and the counter-protest. But I think you're absolutely right. Like on the back of the reporting around Melbourne and the smearing of women involved, I'm sure that put a lot of people off being involved.
Yeah, and what I've seen, and I've spoken to a lot of women about, you know, what happened, not necessarily people that went there, although I've spoken to people that went there as well, is there's real fear. And so, although women might not be going along to this event, they're watching it and they're talking to each other and they're in fear. And like, I think it's quite telling, really, that the police cordons were in Melbourne holding back these people who I got the feeling that they wanted to do violence to those women. And we saw in New Zealand, we saw physical attacks, actual violence.
Yeah.
And
I mean, they really were. It's not like they were just standing there and you're claiming hyperbolically that they were holding them back, right? What I saw is they really were, the police were locked arms and the crowd was straining against them, and we were casting anxious glances back over to this protest to hope they wouldn't break through the lines and assault us. That's how it felt. So it was a real, right? It wasn't just like the police are there and you couldn't really tell whether they were going to be sort of threatening. They were threatening.
Yes. Yes, it was pretty scary. Like, it was pretty hairy. Like, you know, I was on edge as well because I was thinking, well, you know, if they break the police lines, what are they going to do? Like, you know, are they going to just yell and scream, or are they going to start smacking people around? Like, I mean, it wasn't clear to me what their objective was. Yeah. And, as we saw in New Zealand, you know, they physically attacked Kelly and mobbed her, and if she hadn't have had stewards and security and police there, I mean, who knows what would have happened. It looked a pretty hairy situation. Yeah. But that's not the end of it. So we spoke about the consequences of this and what's happened with you personally on campus. I've got some, this is some of the stuff that's going up at Melbourne Uni at the moment. So I'll get this one. This one's particularly disgusting. You can have a look at that. Can you see that? Yeah. And it reads, and this has been posted up all over Melbourne University, is that right? Or
yeah, and can I just say today, on the floor of the building where I teach, they had glued it above the water fountain near the bathrooms so that students going to my lecture would see it, and they'd use this particular glue that you can't just take it down. So it is like 100% targeted at like me and at my students. Yeah. And
it says, "Are you on the side of fascists?" Associate Professor Holly Lawford Smith spoke at the Let Women Speak rally.
I did.
You spoke.
I did.
You're a criminal. You spoke advocating against the existence of trans people. Now, we just had a discussion about trans people and your views on trans people. I didn't hear you advocated against their existence.
I mean, what sane person advocates against anyone's existence?
I haven't heard anyone say that.
They mean something very specific about their identity being affirmed by others, and they use the language of existence to refer to that.
And then they go on to say, a large group of men from the proudly fascist National Socialist Network also attended Sieg Heiling. Well, that's true, they did attend. I don't think they were invited, but they did attend. They were a group of men, by the way. They weren't women speaking. And they've got a sign here, if fascists join you, you ask them to leave. I'm pretty sure they were asked to leave, weren't they?
I don't know. I didn't even know what they were or who they were.
I didn't know either until they started doing the Sieg Heil thing. But and then they say, they identify you, say, Lawford Smith teaches feminism in the course code. In the 2023 winter term there has been an indisputable history of transphobia in the subject. And in big letters down the bottom, do not support fascists and bigots, boycott this subject. So they are imploring students to boycott your subject.
And also this indisputable history of transphobia is that they don't think that I should be able to teach female-centric feminism. So a transphobe should not be allowed to teach feminism. So you can only teach in this way where trans women are women, and you're centering these like vulnerable men in your feminist project.
So this brings us to another really important rights issue. We've spoken about the freedom of association, conflict of rights, but now we're into freedom of speech, right? And particularly academic freedom of speech. Those of you that follow me and are supporters of our party will know that freedom of speech is absolutely one of the most important right, because without it you can't communicate ideas, you can't debate, you can't listen to what other people have to say. It not only is offensive to the person trying to speak, it's offensive to the person's intelligence that wants to listen, that they're incapable of making up their own mind about ideas that they hear.
Right.
And so you're in a case now where people are saying that people shouldn't go to your subjects and listen to what you have to say, because you're dangerous. Like your words or the way that you teach is dangerous. Like, is it really that dangerous to say that? Is it really that dangerous an idea to say that biological women are women and they have particular rights and goals and needs?
Yeah.
Is really that dangerous?
I mean, it's not even at that level yet, right? Like, because philosophy is, I mean, the heart of philosophy is question everything, critique everything. Please come up with an awesome objection to this argument that I've just put to you. Definitely don't just parrot my opinions back to me. That's so boring. It's going to get a bad grade, right? So they're literally, I'm not preaching any ideology. I'm picking excellent papers from the feminist philosophical tradition or feminist theory and other disciplines, and I'm discussing their ideas. And it is over to the students to engage and analyze them as they see fit. So absolutely, you could be in my class as a fully committed and signed up trans activist, and you could disagree with anything you heard that you didn't like and get an excellent grade. You would not hear anything to be afraid of. So of course, even if it was that situation, you'd be right. I would have the right to put those views to them, to try to persuade them, and they would have the right to kind of engage and see what they thought. But I'm not even doing that. So it's ridiculous, 3 times over.
But this is dangerous for academia, right? Because if you get to the point where people with ideas that others don't like, you're pushed out of the university, then this is like almost a Maoist type thing, right? Where the other imagery that people have been using for these things is the struggle sessions. Are you familiar with the struggle sessions? So in Maoist China, what they used to do is people that were that didn't follow the the communist ideology to the correct letter, what they would do is they would have them out in the street, they would have crowds around them, and they would shout at them and scream at them and shame them to the point where they would confess their, their ills, and then they would become, ideologically pure again. And it's like this struggle session. This is sort of what's happening, right?
Yeah,
They're shouting. The mob is shouting at the people who are not ideologically pure enough, and trying to get them to, confess their sins. And
that's literally what happened to Kelly J.
Yeah. It's really lots of people have been they actually showed pictures. I was seeing pictures of these struggle sessions. I'm going, wow, that's sort of what's happening now.
Wow.
Here's another. This is a sticker campaign that apparently has been going up today at Melbourne University. It says, "Only a fascist takes feminism."
This is truly bad, right? Because
Only a fascist takes feminism. I love. I don't know.
I'm sure you have a different commentary to me, but I just want to note before you do that this is targeting my students.
Yeah.
This is not targeting me. This is saying they don't have the right to learn this subject if they do. They're a fascist. That is really crossing a line. Like, the uni can tolerate me being attacked, apparently, but they shouldn't be tolerating students making choices about their education.
This is absolutely attacking your students because they take feminism. You teach feminism, but they take feminism.
Yeah.
Only a fascist takes feminism.
Feminism.
This is I don't know.
It's not real feminism if it doesn't center men.
I haven't.
It's feminism.
I haven't spoken to a lot. I haven't spoken to a lot of fascists. I don't think feminism is top of mind for fascists.
What?
I don't know. Do you get neo-Nazis come to the university and say, "I really want to sign up for feminism now"? This is just ridiculous, right?
I've just started reading this book on. I think it's called The Anatomy of Fascism. So I'll let you know.
All right, let me know. And
feminism.
maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's heaps of fascists that are really, really interested in feminism.
Fascists.
Yeah. So look, I don't know, but
Yeah. No,
So-
it's not a pleasant atmosphere at the moment, and I'm. Yeah.
How are you doing?
I just actually feel worse for my students that I'm teaching at the moment. They're great, but people are coming to me like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but I saw this poster. I'm just letting you know. Or should I have told you know?" Or themselves maybe have sympathetic views toward mine or something kind of adjacent, and then they are sort of feeling targeted by proxy, right? So I've just this really...
Well, they're being called fascists. So.
Yeah, but so it's it sounds stupid. It's emotionally complicated, right? Because people feel defensive of me, protective of me. I'm worried about them and how they're feeling about seeing that stuff about me. It's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible.
So, one of the things that's been happening that's related to all this is people have been, this classic question, what is a woman, right? And I know that, I think, were you wearing the shirt, adult human female, I think?
No, I had ovaries.
Oh, right,
Similar to
ovaries,
this, actually.
okay.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the New Zealand Prime Minister was asked this just the other day. Did you see that exchange? It was you laugh, but
Well,
what else can you do?
everywhere,
What else
isn't
can
it?
you do, right?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that? He couldn't answer, right?
Yeah, I'm not that surprised because that's happening everywhere. People know it's a landmine.
Yeah.
So he was smart enough to know not to give the obvious answer, right? And then he fumbled. But is that probably what his advisors would have wished for him if he didn't have a better answer ready? So, yeah, it's hilarious, but, can you survive politically in New Zealand and tell the truth after what just happened? I don't know. So maybe, I'm not as... it's stupid, but I understand why he responded that way, right? You can't see
But
the
it's
media...
fear, right?
It's fear, but it's but he's representing a party that has a stupid view, and people who elected him who have a stupid view, and he wants to say the right thing given all of that. So of course he can't just say, a woman is an adult human female, next question. It's like they've been fighting to get someone to say that in the UK, right? And even some of the Conservative politicians wouldn't say it.
But I think it was interesting. I think the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, did answer that question and gave the dictionary definition, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Which was sort of surprising to me.
Yeah, that's
so sort of
interesting.
maybe there's I don't know. They must have seen something there. I don't know what the calculation was, but he was quite confident and didn't get a lot of backlash either.
That is interesting. Yeah, what
So
the difference is.
I'd be interested to know what the Victorian Premier would say in answer to that question. He might answer
Do you
very.
need to ask?
Well, I don't know.
Oh my goodness, but he couldn't do a rant like that about women having an event and then not be a trans activist.
Yeah, but I don't know. How do you think he'd answer it?
I think he'd do a silly rant about self-defined gender identity.
Yeah, right.
100%.
So it's just a feeling.
I sat in on, I can't remember if it's actually both. I've seen those politicians do these ridiculous theatrics in Parliament around gender identity for the conversion therapy legislation and the self-ID legislation. Like they're all, okay, that's not fair. Many just like thoroughly co-opted into the ideology from what I've seen.
So it feels like we're sort of at a bit of a moment where I feel like something's shifting in this whole thing.
People say that over and over, and it.
Well,
I wish. Okay,
you
go on.
wish.
No, go on.
But
the tide is turning. I've heard it so many times.
Yeah, well, maybe I'm
For
new to
6
this.
years.
Maybe I'm naive in this area, but like most of what's been happening is people just slinging mud at each other, right? Like calling each other names, right? And
You mean in Victoria, or you mean in
no,
the whole
I
debate?
think globally, like it's
Yeah.
sort of just gone sort of crazy. But like, how do you think that we move forward constructively on this and resolve these issues? Because there really are issues that need to be resolved, and I don't think that a reasonable solution is just like bashing people on the head until they cease to exist. Like what seems to be happening by some people seem to be wanting to do that. How do you think we move forward on this?
There's only two things that can happen if there's going to be any progress at all. Trans activists have to start being reasonable, which I don't have high hopes for, given what I've seen in the last 6 years, because they are acting in such an unreasonable, like refusing dialogue, just, absolute no debate tactics. They won't even give interviews to media showing up at protests, right? They just, and then they just accuse you of the most insane, horrific stuff if you disagree even slightly with this new bizarre ideology. So they could stop it. That would be one thing that would really help move things forward. The other thing is they're going to be how they're going to be. The adults in the room need to stop taking them at their word, start recognizing the conflict of rights, and start working out a reasonable compromise between the groups, regardless of the fact that these activists say that that's unacceptable to them and use this like hyperbolic, ridiculous language. And I think that's the more realistic solution, right? More responsible adults in the room, seeing through that as just being politics and activism. That's fine. They can say what they like, but there is a conflict of rights, and we need to start thinking about how to balance it.
I couldn't agree more. We've gone way longer than I expected, but there's a few questions.
Not as long as I expected.
Okay, so that's fine. We could probably go for hours. We're going to go Joe Rogan style here. But one of my staff members is telling me that there's a few questions, and my computer's stopped working, so that's not going to help at all. But let's try and answer a few questions here. Okay. All right, so there's someone's made a comment about more pervasive issues like perpetuation of, and this is KB, perpetuation of dated, sexualized stereotypes of women that many trans women adopt. So, maybe Dylan Mulvaney is like I'm sure you're familiar with Dylan.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that? Because like many people, I've heard people say, use the term woman face as if they're mocking women. And certainly I've watched many of Dylan's videos and it does appear mocking in many ways because it doesn't appear to me like the way that a woman would normally act. What's your thoughts on that?
I think I have unorthodox opinions on this among gender critical feminists, so what I'm about to say may not represent our group perfectly, but I don't think the problem is woman face. I would be perfectly fine with a man who says he's a man presenting as absolutely femininely as he pleased. So Dylan could look like Dylan and use he, him pronouns and admit that he's a biological male. For me, all the issues disappear then. Because there is just, in a sense, everything has been polarized into masculinity or femininity. It's not like there's really any room outside that to express yourself in like a non-masculine way without being feminine, right? And I don't want to limit anyone's possibilities to express themselves. So for me, the issue is calling yourself a woman, calling yourself female, and taking yourself to be entitled to access women's rights and protections.
That's a really great response.
Thanks.
Yeah. Someone here, Kate, she said about what we were talking about before, about the fear about speaking out, not only fear but also censorship. She said women are not able to speak out in their workplace. They're not able to speak up with concerns about what's happening in schools.
Yep.
That's a whole other issue, which we probably won't have time to go into today. And she's made an observation. She says, I noticed Dan Andrews did a post a few hours ago promoting trans rights, and it said that there were over 700 comments on the post, but 500 comments had been removed. And so there's this they're saying that there's this effort to silence women by any means necessary, is that what they've said.
Wow.
What are your thoughts on that?
I'm really surprised. Again, just revealing a lot of political naivety in this conversation, but I'm really surprised to hear that. That they're hidden. But I wouldn't be surprised at all that there's a lot of pushback, because this happens constantly on Twitter, right? Some company makes a stupid move trying to jump on the trans activist bandwagon, and then there are 1,000 comments from gender critical women all around the world just calling it out and telling them to stop it. So yeah, it would be shocking if Dan Andrews wasn't getting that. But it's very dishonest as the Premier to be hiding that and sort of pretending that there's no dissent. That's really dishonest.
There's a very interesting comment here from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for making this comment. She says, as a transgender woman, I support the rights of women and the sanctity of real womanhood. The extreme trans activists do not stand for many of us who are being lumped in with these whack jobs. That's
awesome.
Her words.
Yeah.
These radical activists are essentially trans Nazis. I want nothing to do with them, she said.
Yeah.
Now, I actually have a lot of sympathy for these people who, for their own reasons, have chosen to transition to a different gender.
Yeah.
And these people, these trans rights activists, are speaking on their behalf, and they don't really speak for people like Sarah. I mean, what's your response to that? And that's very generous of Sarah to interact here, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I also have a lot of sympathy for people in that position, especially people who are sort of like, were operating on this older concept, right, of what it means to be trans or to be transsexual at the time, and then have kind of just had their movement or their sort of minority group status completely hijacked by what is an ideology, right? It is no longer about a group of people who have a particular trait that you can name, like having had sex reassignment surgery or having, in some other sense, had a meaningful medical transition. It's an ideology now. It's a set of ideas. Everyone has a gender identity. You can curate this thing for yourself. Anyone who denies your self-expression is a bigot, right? So this set of beliefs has completely sort of hijacked this minority group's really important, I think, rights and interests, and it is sad. But I don't know I don't think I have sophisticated views on how they what can they do like to reclaim their movement for themselves and kick those guys out?
Well, maybe we need to give them a voice somehow. Another person, Anna, she's giving you a good chance here, Holly. Holly, when does your new book come out? And would you tell us what it's about? So there you go. Please tell us about your new book, Holly.
Is that a true comment?
Well, yes, it is. Yes. I don't know whether you've paid them to make that comment, but anyway, please tell us about your new book.
I did. It's my mum. Hi, Mum. I do have a new book coming out in July.
Right.
I hope. It's called Sex Matters, and it's a collection of 9 essays, all to do with this conflict of interest, so about feminism meets trans issues. The second essay is called Do the Arguments for Trans Women Are Women Succeed?
So if someone wanted to buy that, where could they buy it?
They couldn't yet.
Well, all right. I expect you're having talks with your publisher at the moment. So
It'll be online soon and
Yeah.
people can pre-order it. It's probably going to be annoyingly expensive like last time. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Not much I can do.
And Kate has said, vital in a democracy, and surely if there is no friction at all, that this is an indicator that you're not living in a democracy. So I think Kate's saying that friction is normal in a functioning democracy, and yes, that's true, and that's why we support freedom of speech, so we can nail that out. But if there's not friction, you might not be living in a democracy. So that's an interesting comment. So here's a couple of comments that might be interesting to you, Holly. Mika has said, they figured out TERF no longer works, so now they resort to fascists and Nazis.
Oh, interesting.
That's an interesting observation. What do you make of that?
That's interesting. I had just assumed that fascist and Nazi were specific to the post-Melbourne event debacle, and that trans activists around the world were using it. I haven't seen it. I've been in this since 2018. I've never seen them call gender-critical feminists Nazis or fascists until now.
Okay.
So in my experience, this is new, and I assumed it was because of Melbourne, but
I suppose you can reclaim the word TERF, but you don't really want to reclaim fascists.
Let's go back to this old insult.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe stop insulting us. That would be cool.
And there's another comment by Anna. She said about your embroidery. Is that a Jess Dewal's piece of embroidering you're wearing, Holly?
It actually isn't. I do have identical boiler suit to these with a Jess Dewal's Heretic patch.
Right.
But this is a different patch, just that I found on the Etsy store. So
Etsy's good. So look, thank you so much for coming in and discussing these things with us today, and thank you to everyone that's tuned in to watch what we're talking about here. Look, my goal, as I've said all along, is to try and have discussions about these issues and do it in this most sensible way to the best of my abilities. And I really appreciate you coming to talk to us today. I apologise if we didn't get to your question or comment. There's probably heaps there that I haven't been able to see yet. We might try and get a few in the comments, or maybe Holly would be so gracious as to make a few comments herself if there's something that she could respond to. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much, and stay tuned. There's going to be more to come over the next few weeks. Thanks a lot.